Pizarro, having barely established a foothold in the precarious settlement of San Miguel, stood on the brink of a momentous decision. His contingent, insignificant compared to the empire's presumed might, seemed a mere handful of adventurers cast to the ends of the earth. Each day was a trial, filled with agonizing deliberations over their future strategy. Should they await much-needed reinforcements from Panama, risking discovery and annihilation at any moment? Or, disregarding obvious danger, plunge deeper into the unknown, hostile country, facing an uncertain fate? It was a choice between slow agony and an audacious leap into the abyss, where victory seemed a mirage and defeat inevitable. The decision was dictated less by cold calculation than by desperate resolve and an iron will. However, his personal ambitions alone did not dictate this fateful step. Inaction was poison for desperate adventurers. Having entrenched himself in San Miguel, Pizarro sensed that impatience, bordering on murmuring, was brewing within his ranks. Every day of idleness, spent awaiting mythical reinforcements, only heightened anxiety and lowered morale. These men had come for gold and glory, not for tedious waiting in a foreign land. It became clear. Delay was not an option. Moving forward was not merely a strategic decision, but a necessity dictated by the psychology of the troop. But where? Majestic Cusco, the Inca capital, beckoned with countless treasures, yet the path was long and fraught with peril. Chance, or perhaps fate, suggested a different direction. Rumors reached Pizarro. Atahualpa himself, the supreme Inca and victor in the recent civil war, was in Cajamarca, a city much closer. This was an opportunity not just to invade, but to strike at the very heart of the empire by capturing its ruler. The choice was made. The contingent marched towards Cajamarca, unaware of the minuscule force with which it challenged cyclopean might. Following Pizarro's fateful decision to march on Cajamarca, the conquistadors were confronted with a harsh, almost absurd reality. His army was ridiculously small, just 110 infantrymen, many armed only with swords, shields, and a few arquebuses, and 67 horsemen. It was a truly pitiful force, a handful of men desperately venturing into the unknown. Opposing them, according to intelligence reports, was Atahualpa's multi-thousand-strong army, between 40,000 and 50,000 battle-hardened Inca warriors, fresh from victory in a bloody civil war. The contrast was staggering, casting doubt on the very possibility of success. How could this tiny expedition hope to triumph over such an overwhelming force? This question undoubtedly hung in the air, prompting every Spaniard to deeply ponder their impending fate. Faced with such overwhelming superiority, with every step leading into the unknown heart of a foreign empire, Pizarro made an unexpected move. He halted his contingent, challenging their resolve. Anyone afraid could return to San Miguel, where meager supplies and phantom safety awaited. Of the entire force, only 9 men retreated, preferring the familiar path to a desperate adventure. The remaining 168 weary souls were swayed not only by promises of glory and gold. For many, the return journey would mean not only disgrace, but the collapse of all hopes, and possibly death from hunger or disease in a foreign land where they were unsupported strangers. The choice was not between victory and defeat, but between risk and utter despair. Now, with the path back cut off, only one option remained: to press forward towards an ancient civilization whose magnificent roads already lay beneath their feet. The 168 conquistadors, having cast aside their last doubts, pressed deeper into the Andes. Their path wound along the legendary Inca roads, masterpieces of ancient engineering, snaking through impassable gorges and dizzying passes. Every uphill step was a trial. The thin air pressed on their lungs, the cold pierced to the bone, and the endless switchbacks seemed to mock their ambitions. But with each passing day, not only physical strain but also anticipation grew. They knew they were heading not merely toward another tribe, but a colossal civilization whose might and wealth were already palpable in the very architecture of these roads, and in the rare but impressive settlements they encountered. Ahead lay Cajamarca, and within it, the heart of a giant empire that they, a handful of strangers, intended to conquer. Beyond every turn, beyond every mountain peak, lay a power unfathomable to Europeans. While Pizarro's tiny contingent boldly ventured into the Andes, a true civilization, spanning thousands of kilometers, moved towards them. The great Inca Empire, Tawantinsuyu, This was a state whose might and organization were unparalleled in the New World, and whose wealth seemed inexhaustible. At the peak of its power, following a bloody civil war, stood Atahualpa, not merely an Inca, but a triumphant victor who had crushed his brother Huascar and asserted sole rule over millions of subjects. He was moving to Cajamarca not out of fear or flight, but rather with the regal leisure of a conqueror. Here, in the valley, he was enjoying healing hot springs and surveying new territories, unaware of the approaching shadow that was already challenging his unshakable grandeur. Pizarro, realizing that an open battle against tens of thousands of Inca warriors would be suicidal, hatched a plan bordering on madness. His only hope remained an audacious maneuver, the capture of the Sapa Inca himself. Such an action, he calculated, would decapitate the empire, depriving it of central leadership and plunging it into chaos. For the 168 conquistadors marching towards an innumerable army, the very idea of such audacity seemed incredible. But in their hearts, scorched by the thirst for gold and glory, a unique, almost mystical self-perception emerged. As one chronicler later noted, on that day, there was no distinction between great and small. On that day, all were knights. This conviction, this inner transformation from desperate adventurers into valiant conquerors, allowed them to challenge the impossible. They were ready for the decisive strike. The day arrived that would forever change the destiny of Tawantinsuyu. Cajamarca's plaza, carefully cleared and surrounded by Spanish soldiers hidden in the buildings, lay in wait. Then, Atahualpa's procession appeared, a spectacle as magnificent as it was tragically naive. Tens of thousands of indigenous people accompanied their ruler, but this was not a military parade. It was a ceremonial procession. Ahead marched sweepers clearing the path, followed by nobles in lavish attire, carrying banners and regalia. The Inca himself, seated on a golden palanquin adorned with feathers and precious stones, was the embodiment of absolute power and serenity. His warriors, if present, remained outside the city or carried only ceremonial weapons. They were walking into a trap, unaware that their openness and belief in dialogue would be their undoing. The Spaniards, clutching arquebuses and swords in their sweaty hands, had already made their choice, and it was far from honorable. And so, when Cajamarca's plaza was completely filled with unarmed Inca nobility and their attendants, and Atahualpa was seated in his palanquin, Pizarro gave the prearranged signal. The thunderous roar of the single Spanish cannon shattered the silence, deafening and sowing panic. It was echoed by volleys of arquebuses, and as if by magic, conquistadors poured out from all hiding places. Spanish horsemen on their powerful steeds, clad in steel, slammed into the stunned crowd, followed by infantry rushing in with drawn blades. For the Incas, who had never before encountered firearms and cavalry, it was an absolute shock. Grandeur instantly turned into unimaginable horror. Thousands of people who had come for a celebration found themselves trapped, their triumphant procession becoming a nightmare where there was neither honor nor a chance to resist. Pizarro's signal pierced the air, and hell broke loose. The Spaniards descended upon the stunned, unarmed crowd. Cannons roared, arquebuses spewed death, and the conquistadors' steel ruthlessly mowed down the unarmed indigenous people. Cajamarca's plaza instantly turned into a slaughterhouse. Thousands of Incas, who had come for a peaceful meeting, found themselves in a deadly trap. They were helpless against European weaponry and tactics. A stampede, panic, screams of terror, all merged into a monstrous maelstrom. The conquistadors, intoxicated by easy victory, showed no mercy, unleashing rivers of blood. Bodies fell one after another, forming mountains of dead. This was not a battle, but a one-sided extermination, where every sword thrust and arquebus shot found its victim among the defenseless. Chaos instantly engulfed Cajamarca. In this unimaginable slaughter, Francisco Pizarro, known for his courage but, ironically, a rather mediocre horseman, fought on foot, hacking his way to the center of the indigenous throng. His gaze was fixed on Atahualpa's golden palanquin. The Incas, confronted with unseen weapons and tactics, did not waver in their loyalty. They desperately tried to protect their ruler, literally shielding him with their bodies. When the warriors carrying the palanquin were killed, others immediately took their place, even with severed hands continuing to hold the sacred throne until death claimed them. It was a spectacle of horrifying devotion, but Pizarro saw only his objective. He needed Atahualpa alive. the key to unraveling the empire's mystery. With each swing of his sword, he approached his prize, cutting through a living wall of desperation and valor. In this chaos, where every step came at the cost of a life, Pizarro himself, casting aside doubts, lunged towards the palanquin. His blood-stained hand seized Atahualpa, pulling the supreme Inca from beneath the piled bodies. The moment the ruler of Tawantinsuyu was captured, the slaughter in Cajamarca's plaza ceased as abruptly as it began. In just 2 hours, a mere blink in historical terms, between 6,000 and 7,000 Incas were killed or trampled. For the Spaniards themselves, it was an event bordering on a miracle. A handful of men had crushed a multi-thousand-strong army and captured its leader. They were convinced. This was not mere luck, but the undoubted will of God, blessing their crusade. Atahualpa, now in chains, did not yet grasp the full depth of his tragedy. Seeing these strangers merely as gold-hungry barbarians, with whom a deal could be struck by offering them countless riches. In his tragic naivety, the captured Atahualpa could not comprehend the true scale of these foreigners' ambitions and boundless greed. He saw them merely as barbarians obsessed with the glitter of precious metals, believing they could simply be bought off. In his mind, the fate of a great empire came down to a simple transaction, one he was accustomed to in his dealings with his subjects. In this fatal misconception, the Inca made an offer that became one of the most incredible in the annals of conquest: freedom in exchange for countless treasures. He was genuinely convinced that by satiating their insatiable thirst for gold, he could rid himself of these uninvited guests forever. Captured, yet still godlike to his people, Atahualpa quickly realized that the Spaniards desired not his life, but his treasures. In a desperate attempt to buy freedom, he made an offer that astonished even the avaricious conquistadors. He promised to fill one of the palace rooms where he was held with gold as high as he could reach, approximately 10.5 feet. And even more astonishingly, double the amount in silver. For the fulfillment of this unimaginable condition, he set a deadline of 60 days. The promise was colossal, but its execution was destined to become an even greater confirmation of the Incas' absolute power and the untold riches of an empire the Spaniards were only beginning to comprehend. In captivity, Atahualpa remained a living god to his people, whose words were absolute law. And the empire fulfilled this law with astonishing, almost tragic devotion. By his command, from all corners of Tawantinsuyu, from the most remote provinces to the sacred temples of Cusco, an unprecedented collection of treasures began. Caravans laden with precious metals, gold ornaments, ritual objects, silver effigies, converged on Cajamarca. This was not merely a stream of wealth, but a vivid demonstration of the colossal abundance of Inca civilization, and, more importantly, a unique, almost mystical power structure where the word of the captive Inca held absolute sway. Every ingot, every gold leaf delivered to the conquistador camp confirmed the people's absolute faith in their ruler. Atahualpa's promise was not an empty one. Within the stipulated period, unending streams of gold and silver flowed into Cajamarca from all corners of the vast empire. Not mere coins, but exquisite works of art, ritualistic items, symbols of power and faith. The room indeed was filled with priceless treasures from floor to ceiling. And it was here, at the peak of the fulfillment of their terms, that the true, ruthless nature of the conquerors became evident. Despite the agreement being met, the Spaniards treacherously broke their word. For them, gold was just metal, not a sacred symbol. This dazzling, historic volume of treasures was ruthlessly melted down into ingots, destroying invaluable cultural heritage. After the distribution of the spoils, which made every conquistador fantastically wealthy, the question of the captive Inca's fate arose. Although some Spaniards, including priests, argued against it, Atahualpa was sentenced to execution on false charges. His death, following this unprecedented ransom, became an act of unimaginable cruelty and betrayal that forever changed the fate of the Andean world. But this was only the beginning of a new, long journey through the conquered lands. After Atahualpa's treacherous execution, the Spaniards immediately marched to the heart of the empire, the sacred city of Cusco. It was a grand march of over 800 miles through the impassable Andes, a journey fraught with dangers and fierce resistance. Despite the death of their supreme ruler, the Incas did not lose heart. Led by newly elected chiefs, they desperately fought for every valley, every pass. The conquistadors, though few in number, faced unceasing ambushes and fierce skirmishes, turning their advance into a series of bloody battles. Spanish tactics, combined with iron discipline and superior weaponry, allowed them to overcome the enemy's numerical superiority. In these clashes, which seemed hopeless for the Incas, the true nature of their defeat began to emerge, rooted not only in steel and gunpowder. On the battlefield, not only iron and gunpowder played a decisive role, but also a weapon unseen by the Incas: horses. These powerful animals, never before witnessed by the indigenous people, became a source of both awe-inspiring terror and panic. The charge of Spanish cavalry was akin to a natural disaster. Each horseman, like a mythical beast, sowed panic, sending thousands fleeing and trampling those who couldn't escape. The psychological effect was colossal. The casualty ratio was monstrous. For every fallen Spaniard, hundreds, sometimes thousands, of Incas were killed or trampled. This lethal efficiency, combined with superior weaponry, allowed the conquistadors to methodically forge their way through the Andes to the heart of the empire, where riches awaited them that surpassed even Atahualpa's legendary ransom. After a grueling march through the mountain passes, Pizarro and his exhausted but avaricious men finally reached Cusco. The heart of the empire, the sacred city, proved to be not only a citadel of power, but also an untold treasury, literally oozing gold. The riches awaiting them here surpassed even the incredible ransom collected for Atahualpa. Temples, palaces, tombs, everything was subjected to ruthless plunder. Tons of precious metals, skillfully crafted by Inca artisans into works of art, were mindlessly melted down into standard ingots, losing their artistic value but gaining universal purchasing power. This was an unprecedented flow of wealth, destined to dazzle both Europe and the Spanish crown. The sheer volume of the spoils was so overwhelming that even seasoned conquistadors were astounded. However, in these golden currents, Pizarro saw not only personal gain, but also an opportunity for the establishment of a new order, seeking to lend an appearance of legitimacy to his rule. After the plunder of Cusco, Pizarro faced the task not only of holding what had been conquered, but also of lending some semblance of legitimacy to his rule in the eyes of the Incas. Instead of completely annihilating Inca statehood, he made a move that, at first glance, seemed wise. He installed a new Sapa Inca on the throne. The choice fell upon the young Manco Inca Yupanqui, brother of the executed Atahualpa. This was an attempt to create a puppet ruler through whom the Spaniards could govern the vast empire, utilizing traditional Inca structures. In a lavish ceremony, reminiscent of ancient rituals, Pizarro crowned Manco. This measure seemed designed to bring peace and order, solidifying Spanish dominion under the guise of continuity. But it was merely a thin veil, concealing the true state of affairs. Beneath the veneer of this feigned stability, the seeds of new chaos were already brewing, foreshadowing that the true governance of these lands would prove a far more complex task than their conquest. And so he stood at the apex of the world. Francisco Pizarro, a 50-year-old conquistador, once an illiterate swineherd, was now the absolute master of a vast, once flourishing empire. The conquest of Cusco concluded the military phase but only opened a new, far more complex chapter in his life. Before him lay not merely a pile of gold, but a colossal, highly organized country requiring governance. Pizarro's experience was limited to warfare and intrigue, certainly not state-building. His triumph was stunning, but now he had to learn to be not only a conqueror, but also a ruler. The task seemed almost insurmountable. How to integrate these lands and peoples into the Spanish crown? How to ensure order and stability when the shadows of recent battles raged and the flames of hidden resistance smoldered all around? This new reality demanded entirely different approaches to organizing life in the conquered territories. The military phase of the conquest had ended, but Francisco Pizarro faced a new, no less monumental task: to solidify Spanish dominion across the vast expanse of the Inca Empire. This required not merely garrisons, but fully fledged cities, centers of power, trade, and colonization, destined to become the foundation of the new order. The construction of these strongholds became his primary mission. Over several years, the conquistadors founded 7 key cities, each playing a role in the formation of the viceroyalty of Peru. Among them, Ciudad de los Reyes, the City of Kings, now known as Lima, founded by Pizarro on January 18, 1535, held a special place. The fertile Rimac River Valley was chosen, providing convenient access to the sea and allowing direct communication with the mother country, bypassing the impassable Andes. It was Lima, not Cusco, that was destined to become the new capital, a symbol of Spanish power and civilization. These cities, erected at strategic points, were intended to serve not only as residences for Spaniards, but also as a springboard for further territorial expansion. However, these new centers of power, designed to strengthen Spanish rule, also became a catalyst for profound upheaval for those who originally inhabited these lands. The conquest brought not only new governance but also an unprecedented catastrophe. With the Europeans came diseases to which the indigenous people had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, and influenza decimated entire villages, turning flourishing valleys into graveyards. Millions of lives were swept away by this invisible enemy, reducing the empire's population by orders of magnitude. Simultaneously with this demographic collapse, the foundation of Inca prosperity, their unique agriculture, crumbled. Grandiose irrigation systems and terraces, requiring collective labor, fell into disuse due to population loss. Fields became overgrown, canals dried up, leading to famine and further decline. Pizarro issued decrees to protect the indigenous people, but the reality was far harsher. The thirst for gold, the power of individual conquistadors, and the encomienda system ruthlessly exploited the survivors, making their plight unbearable. It was an era of profound disruption and tragedy, hidden beneath an outward semblance of order. While the conquered empire slowly recovered from the upheavals, and its indigenous population continued to suffer under the yoke of the new power, Francisco Pizarro himself, now the absolute ruler, seemed to enjoy the fruits of his extraordinary labors. In the new capital, Ciudad de los Reyes, he established a luxurious residence for himself. Amid lush gardens, under the warm Peruvian sun, the former swineherd strolled, observing the rapid growth and development of the city destined to become the jewel of the New World. He received petitioners, dispensed justice, and issued orders, creating the illusion of firm and stable Spanish dominion. It seemed the worst storms were behind him, and the great conquistador had finally found deserved peace at the pinnacle of his power. However, this apparent tranquility was merely a deceptive calm before an impending catastrophe, whose shadows were already gathering on the horizon. While Francisco Pizarro enjoyed the fruits of his conquest in the new capital, shadows gathered on the horizon, foreshadowing a new catastrophe. His younger brothers, Juan and Gonzalo, left in Cusco, displayed not only excessive greed but also blatant disregard for the puppet Inca Manco. Agreements, albeit fictitious, regarding his status were flagrantly violated. They did not merely exploit his position, they personally humiliated him, subjecting him to public insults and even physical abuse. This became the last straw for the young ruler, whose people were already groaning under the yoke of foreigners and disease. While outwardly maintaining submission, Manco Inca began a secret mobilization. Under the cover of night, through cunning messages, his call for rebellion spread throughout the empire, reaching its most remote corners. The Incas, exhausted but unbroken, prepared for a final desperate struggle for their land and freedom. Manco Inca's vengeance was swift. In the spring of 1536, when the conquistadors felt relatively secure, a grand rebellion erupted across the empire. Tens of thousands of indigenous warriors, driven by a single goal, to expel the foreigners, surrounded Cusco. The siege of the ancient capital turned into a true nightmare for the Spaniards. Waves of Manco Inca's attacks crashed upon the city, transforming it into a crucible of battle. Every attempt by the conquistadors to break the siege ended in disaster. Expeditions sent from Lima to aid the besieged were defeated one after another, their losses numbering in the hundreds. The Spaniards bled, their ranks dwindling, and it seemed their days of dominion were numbered. The Great Rebellion raged until December, encompassing vast territories and revealing the true scale of resistance. The siege of Cusco lasted for months, draining the conquistadors' meager forces to their limit. It seemed the ultimate collapse of Spanish dominion was imminent, as Manco Inca's rebellion encompassed vast territories, and reinforcements from Lima had been decisively defeated. However, fate had an unexpected turn in store for the conquerors. At the most critical moment when the Spaniards were on the verge of capitulation, new forces approached the city. These were the troops of Diego de Almagro, returning from an unsuccessful expedition to Chile, who, by chance or providence, broke the siege. Fresh soldiers and horses decisively shifted the balance of power. Recognizing the futility of further struggle for Cusco, Manco Inca did not break. He did not await ignominious capture. But, displaying extraordinary will and strategic thinking, led the remnants of his loyal warriors deep into the impenetrable Amazonian jungles. There, in the valley of Vilcabamba, hidden from the Spaniards, he founded a new, albeit reduced, Inca state, becoming a symbol of unconquered spirit and continued resistance. This new chapter in the history of the conquest, however, brought not only relief to Pizarro, but also the seeds of new, equally fierce conflicts within the Spanish ranks themselves. However, the triumphant lifting of the siege of Cusco did not bring peace. On the contrary, it merely opened a new, far more brutal chapter, the conflict between Francisco Pizarro and his former comrade-in-arms, Diego de Almagro. Tensions between them had been escalating for a long time, rooted in deep grievances and unfulfilled ambitions. Almagro, who considered himself an equal partner in the conquest of Peru, felt shortchanged in the division of glory and riches. He believed his contribution was undervalued and his share of the conquered lands unjustly small. A particular stumbling block was Cusco, the ancient Inca capital. Almagro asserted that this wealthiest city should belong to him according to royal decrees. This dispute over ownership of the heart of the Inca Empire quickly escalated into an irreconcilable enmity that would soon erupt into open conflict. After the siege of Cusco was lifted, the smoldering conflict between Francisco Pizarro and Diego de Almagro flared up with unprecedented intensity. It was not merely a struggle for territory, but a brutal clash between former comrades-in-arms, where yesterday's allies became mortal enemies. In the fierce Battle of Las Salinas, the forces of Hernando Pizarro, Francisco's younger brother, inflicted a crushing defeat upon Almagro's troops. The fate of the old conquistador was sealed with the same ruthlessness as that of Atahualpa. Diego de Almagro was captured and, despite his past merits and pleas, executed by Hernando's order. This very ruthlessness, a hallmark of the conquerors, did not spare Hernando himself. Upon his return to Spain, he was imprisoned for decades, paying the price for his cruelty and ambition. Thus, power gained through bloodshed devoured its own children. Yet, while the Spanish conquerors tore each other apart, Francisco Pizarro focused on establishing his new world in Lima. After the storm of infighting subsided and his last rival was eliminated, Francisco Pizarro seemed to have reached his zenith. Establishing himself in the new capital, Ciudad de los Reyes, he set about consolidating his power and ordering his daily life. His days in Lima unfolded steadily, filled with administrative duties, meetings with new settlers, and indigenous Caracas. Don Francisco, now a marquis, strolled through the streets of the burgeoning city, overseeing the construction of the cathedral and palace, which were intended to symbolize his greatness. His home, though furnished with some ostentatious luxury, reflected his status as a conqueror. However, behind the facade of this triumph, behind the external order and apparent peace, something else was hidden. Deep within this unyielding man, who had endured unthinkable trials and committed monstrous deeds, lay a subtle unease. Gold, power, glory, all were within his grasp, yet they brought no true peace. Francisco Pizarro, by this time a marquis, sat atop a pyramid built from Inca gold and blood. He, a former swineherd, had become unimaginably wealthy, the ruler of vast lands. Yet this fabulous wealth, these palaces and titles, seemed to bring him no genuine joy. Nearing 70, he did not revel in the fruits of his conquests. Instead, he was consumed by a different, deeper ambition, the continuation of his lineage, the immortalization of his family name in the New World. His thoughts were occupied with governing the colony, building Lima, and securing the future of his brothers and descendants. But beneath the mask of triumph and outward steadfastness, a certain internal disquiet lingered, a premonition, perhaps, that great deeds always demand a reckoning. However, the elimination of Diego de Almagro did not bring Pizarro the longed-for peace. A far more dangerous threat was brewing behind his back. Not everyone had reconciled with the execution of his old partner. A handful of his loyal but impoverished supporters, stripped of power and wealth, burned with fierce hatred for the Marquis. Their destitution was so profound that, according to legend, the entire group shared a single hat, passing it among themselves when venturing out to maintain some semblance of propriety. This humiliation only fueled their thirst for revenge. These men of Almagro, or partidas, as they were called, wove a conspiracy under the leadership of Diego de Almagro the Younger, son of the executed man. Numerous warnings of the impending assassination reached Pizarro, but the Marquis, blinded by overconfidence or weary from endless intrigues, disregarded them, as if fate had already delivered his own final verdict. His last days were numbered. And so it seemed all battles were behind him, Pizarro's power solidified, and his enemies vanquished. But fate, as is well known, is unpredictable. On the fateful Sunday morning of June 26, 1541, while Lima still slept, a group of conspirators, the men of Almagro, driven by a thirst for vengeance, stormed his palace. The Marquis, elderly but still possessing his former resolve, met the assassins with sword in hand. It was a desperate, unequal struggle. He fought fiercely, but against a multitude of blades and spears he stood no chance. Pizarro fell, bleeding from innumerable wounds, on the floor of his own home. The sight of his death became a symbol of a bloody era, and his remains, resting in Lima's cathedral, still bear silent witness. An inscription is engraved on the conqueror's skull, serving as his epitaph: Discoverer and Conqueror of the Incas, Peruvian Empire. This title, etched into bone, forever imprinted his name in history, but also the shadow of those who fell under his sway.